versed in this code of conduct and what to do if there's a question about perhaps stepping over the line. So with that, I was going to say thanks to those who worked on this, and it was approved by the board. Oh gosh, I'm losing track of time. I think at our end of July meeting when we were meeting in person here in Minneapolis. So Kathleen was giving me the head nod, yes. So anyway, and thank you to John Tropper in particular who headed up the work on this. And all those are on this listed here on this slide. So with that, let me hand it back over to Nikita to kick things off.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for those words. And right now I'm going to hand it over to John Tropper.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Nikita, and thank you, Lynn. As Nikita had mentioned, please use the chat function if anybody has questions throughout the webinar today. We will also, later in the webinar towards the end, we'll do a question and answer session, and people will be able to unmute at that time, so you'll have the option to use either. So with that said, as Lynn had mentioned, this basically moved forward since last year at a rather rapid pace. And we hope to never have to utilize it, but we do recognize that this is an organic process, organic documents, that as time goes on, we're going to find that we're going to learn, we're going to develop best practices that have already been implemented and brought to this is the development of the code of conduct. But as it says here on the slide, it's an ongoing evolution. From that standpoint, we hope to never learn. We hope that no incidences ever occur that are brought to the ethics subcommittee to address code of conduct issues. But obviously, just by the very nature of the fact that it exists and the potential for observer effect, there is always that possibility. So should that occur, we now have a process in place. With that said, to go over a little bit of the history as to how this came about, I want to introduce Amy Colleen and also be thankful that Amy was able to join us here today, considering the hurricane. So kicking it over to Amy now.
Yeah, thanks, John. You can do a lot these days without power or water, but you know, I've gone to the bathroom 10 times to try to get water or flush the toilet already, and just making it work. So again, I think slide 4, Kelsey. The ethics subcommittee was formed, I want to say last year, a year before. I guess 2 years ago, as chair of the governance committee from the board perspective, you know, we recognized through discussions with the MA that, you know, we really didn't have anything in place to address any type of unethical or, you know, conflicts within the Federation. So at the time, the governance committee pulled together, like John was mentioning, the policy and recommended that the ethics subcommittee become a board committee. And like we mentioned here, the ethics subcommittee reports to the board's governance committee. It's made of 3 current board members, and that's purposeful. We do have a lot of other board committees that involve and have other volunteers on it, but from an ethics perspective, we felt it was very important. And in talking with our legal counsel, you know, board members have confidentiality requirements. We sign documents where we can't share information. We certainly consider this to be confidential. So, you know, we want to make sure it's a limited small group that, like Lynn said, if we ever had to use it, we want to keep it in that small group within just a very few actual board members. So if anything were ever to be reported via the documents we're going to discuss later on, that would come to the ethics subcommittee. You know, they would lead, develop, and kind of take the lead on any complaint. The ethics subcommittee is also responsible for developing the code of conduct, which we'll talk through here. And then, like it says, make determinations on actions related to complaints, communicating decisions to all appropriate parties and back to the board. So I think that's kind of the background of it here. You know, I guess we're happy that we're almost 100 years old and we haven't really had any major issues with this, but we do see as an organization, a very large organization, that having a code of conduct is absolutely necessary, and going through the process to develop it was certainly needed. And again, we just hope we rarely have to use it. So back over to you, John.
Thank you, Amy. This here shows the milestones of basically the creation of the code of conduct and the underlying documents to support that as well. As Amy had mentioned, the ethics subcommittee really came into existence last year at WEF. So this was a rapid development project here, but that does not mean that it was not a very well vetted project. We incorporated numerous stakeholder groups to ensure that we addressed all the possible perspectives relative to WEF members. So if you can give me the next slide. Thank you. So you can see here the various stakeholder groups that were involved. We had the bylaw subcommittee represented by Mike Kyle, the Committee Leadership Council with Ian Fife, the DE&I subcommittee, as well as the trustee, Iftiah Benner, the ethics subcommittee that constituted Amy, Gustavo Gallo, and myself, and then the governance committee overall as well, including Raj Bhattarai, Jackie Gerald, Nikita, Sue Sullivan, and Iftiah once again. The House of Delegates represented by Nikita. Mary Berry brought very interesting and important perspectives from the MA staff standpoint. We had Kathleen Waugh, Penny Young, and Julia from the WEF staff, as well as WEF legal counsel Barbara Dunn. And each and every one of these individuals participated in a manner that brought not only the perspective for the group that they represented, as well as themselves, but also did so in a very expeditious manner. So we were able to move this effort forward very quickly, but through a very good vetted process. And that's what led to where we are today. So with that said, I'm going to kick you now over to Kathleen for her to work with Barbara in the next section. Thank you.
Thanks, John. When the ethics subcommittee first started to look at this issue, we recognized that there was a difference between promulgating a code of ethics for the profession and doing an organization's code of conduct. I mean, our membership is not profession-based per se, it's more sector-based. It's the water sector, and we have membership that is comprised of wastewater operators, utility managers, engineers, consultants, manufacturers. So we decided pretty quickly on we were not simply doing an aspirational code for a profession, but what we really wanted to try to do was address conduct or behavior that would govern WEF membership, whenever a WEF member participated in a WEF activity, went to a WEF meeting, and it actually became fairly broad ranging when we started thinking about the different roles that a member may play within WEF. So I'll let Barbara get more into that when she goes through some of the details. But I first, as I said, wanted to give a grounding and the distinction between a code of conduct, which is enforceable as well as aspirational, versus a code of ethics for a profession. And now I'd like to introduce Barbara Dunn. Barbara Dunn comes to us from Barnes & Thornburg. She's based in our Chicago office, well, in Barnes & Thornburg's Chicago office. So we're hoping that she is able to come to WEF Tech this year so we can meet her in person instead of having all our interaction over Zoom. So Barbara is with Barnes & Thornburg's nonprofit practice. She's a specialist in tax-exempt organizations, steeped in the laws and regulations governing nonprofits. She's been a great help to us with various governance issues, certainly a great help to us on developing the code of conduct. She's also a contract expert. She's very well known in the association industry, and she's been helping us do a lot of contracts for WEF Tech, et cetera. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Barbara Dunn.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good day, everyone. I hope you're safe and well. It's been my pleasure to get to work with WEF, the staff team, including Kathleen, as well as the volunteers, all of which worked on this project. One of the things that I started discussing with Kathleen early in this process is that the best strategy when it comes to putting in place an enforceable code of conduct, as Kathleen mentioned, distinguished from a code of ethics, which is aspirational, is the fact that you need to get many stakeholder groups involved. And that's really where the structure and the timeline for this process has been ideal. And of course, all the volunteers that have committed their time and talent to looking at everything. To get all perspectives is important, certainly as well today, to get your perspectives and your questions are important. As Kathleen mentioned, I work with all types of nonprofits, and over many years working with them both to initiate a code of conduct and to set up the structure for that, but also to come in when a code of conduct process is not working and offer recommendations and changes. Fortunately, as it is the case when you're building something, it's probably a lot easier and better to build it from the ground up anew versus changing it. And that's the opportunity we had at WEF. We had an opportunity to build it from the ground up. And that really is ideal. And that really distinguishes WEF from many organizations that have codes of conduct, but which don't enforce them, or for which there are holes in gaps in that process. So WEF is really in good shape. I'll acknowledge, as John mentioned, and as Amy mentioned as well, this process has evolved. It's been very organic, if you will, in its development, and it will continue to evolve. I, like Amy and John, hope we never have to deal with any of these, but having the structure here to support that is really the most important thing to do. So with that said, understanding from my perspective, I've been working with the group, there are a couple hallmarks when it comes to codes of conduct. Certainly, first and foremost in my mind is the concept of due process. That concept essentially embodies the fact that if someone files a complaint against a member, that the individual who the complaint is about, their bad conduct, or alleged bad conduct, that they have an opportunity to fully understand the nature of the complaint and to respond to that complaint. That's really the hallmark as you think about in our court system and other settings. Due process is really key. So as we go through that procedure, you'll see that built in, and as you had a chance potentially to look at the materials, you'll see that built in as well. Another thing here is protection of confidentiality. Certainly when we get into conduct, much of which this conduct that you see on our code is not ideal. It's not good. It's not the kind of conduct that we would want a lot of folks to know about. And so we're very careful in how we've set up our process, how we've limited the scope of individuals who might know about a complaint and build it from there. Definitely concerned about potential exposure if some confidential information gets leaked. So you'll see that built into the process, but that again is a hallmark as well. And finally, just how we roll it out. We're going to talk a little bit about implementation. But as a member of WEF, and if a WEF member is also a member of an MA, this code essentially is going to be part and parcel of their WEF membership. Ultimately, as we renew memberships and as folks apply, they'll acknowledge this. But once we announce it and roll it out, it is our intention to continue to abide by it, expect that our members abide by it, provide materials and resources and training for it. And then ultimately, if unfortunately there is an issue, that we're ready to receive those complaints. One final comment in this is conflict of interest. Conflicts of interest, as you know, come up in a lot of settings, but my experience in the ethics side is that conflicts of interest come up when folks who are reviewing the complaints at any level know the individual that's been accused. In that case, I always have that individual refrain from discussion and voting on that matter. That's really important. And while it's certainly important to have a due process, objective process for the individual who's being complained about, it also serves to protect the back, so to speak, of the individuals who are reviewing the complaint. You know, essentially you weren't in the room where it happened, to quote the line from Hamilton there, in protecting that individual. So you'll see in our process that we have that built in, that conflicts will be vetted ahead of the time to make sure that the folks looking at the complaint do not have a conflict. So let's take a look at the next slide. I think it's important to start a little bit with some definitions. You'll see we have the definition of WEF participants. We intend that this term be very broad in scope. That is, the individuals for whom a conduct might be addressed to, or may have been, so-called victim of or recipient of, maybe that's a better word, of the conduct. It's not just to WEF members, although obviously that's the key group, WEF staff, contractors, and other non-members which might attend a WEF function or a WEF activity. So non-members who attend WEF, for example, are considered for purposes of the code to be a WEF participant. So it's a very broad scope. It's the intention that it be broad in scope to cover those many stakeholder groups, all of whom play an important role within WEF. Further, you'll see that definition of WEF functions. Here again, WEF sponsored functions, obviously our large meetings, as well as WEF Tech. We also intend that WEF member association functions are included, as well as WEF affiliated functions. And if a WEF member is representing WEF within another organization, we would intend to say that that non-WEF, if they're on WEF business, then that would be considered a WEF function for purpose of the code. So again, here you can see that we've drawn a pretty broad scope as to where we expect, or circumstances, if you will, in which we will expect members to comply with the code of conduct. Take a look at the next slide. So who and what is the code applicable to? As I mentioned on that definition page, it's really intended to say that any conduct or communication of a WEF member, so the individual who is accused, if you will, of the bad conduct is a WEF member, and that conduct has to involve, and again, that's quite a broad word, but involve WEF participants at any WEF function. So you can see how those pieces really come together. We've got a WEF member, that's got to be the person who's being complained about, and then you've got the people who, the complainants are WEF participants, and the allegations may relate to a WEF function. And as I mentioned earlier, that concept of due process, protection of member rights is really important. And this is where we've really taken a lot of time to draw in a process that we're going to follow uniformly and consistently. And that starts with someone filing a complaint. Having that individual submit a complaint form, which will prompt them to provide certain information, to have them sign off saying they believe that's true, and to provide corresponding documentation. And then to the extent we believe that that does raise an issue on the code of conduct, that the individual, the accused, so to speak, the WEF member, has an opportunity to see that complaint and an opportunity to respond to that complaint. So that's really the first level of process. At the next step would be the ethics subcommittee review of the matter. And ultimately, the ethics subcommittee will review a matter and may recommend an outcome for that particular matter, but ultimately it'll be up to the board as it may relate to any types of discipline. You know, the disciplinary actions obviously are the key aspects of any code of conduct. Those disciplinary actions can range from a letter of censure to all the way to expulsion and everything in between. And every case is different, every circumstance is different. So you'll note in our code that while we provide for those different levels, every case is going to be reviewed separately, and every case ultimately, whatever the outcome would go through the board, and that's another important process. And then one more layer here to add again that due process is a final appeal process. So to the extent our board determines that someone should be disciplined, then the appeals group, which is a different group of folks, will take a final look at the matter and either affirm the board's decision, or if it chose to do so, implement a lesser discipline. And with the appeal itself, we put the burden on the individual, the WEF member, to submit information as to why they believe they should have the benefit of an appeal. So we've got that uniformity and consistency as well. Let's look at the next slide. Many of you know, and I know how important the MAs are. So many of you listening in and the activities that you do at the level. So I want to mention a little bit about the cross connect or overlap, if you will, between the WEF code of conduct and MAs. So WEF members are subject to the code of conduct, as I'd mentioned earlier, and any other additional codes that the MA may have. So the WEF member and their membership at their particular MA, if that MA has its own code, then that WEF member essentially has two codes to follow, if you will. And again, we want to make sure if a conduct occurs at a WEF function or an MA event, then that would be covered as well. If there's a circumstance of a WEF member acting in bad conduct at an MA event level, we would definitely look at that as part of the complaint process. Again, the individual involved must be that dual member, if you will, the member of WEF and the member of the MA, in order to fall within our jurisdiction, if you will. I know there are some circumstances in which the MA members are only members of the MA. They're not members of WEF. And in that case, WEF doesn't necessarily have jurisdiction over that situation. So, that said, there's going to be that gap, if you will. And if the member association wants to develop its own policy or its own code of conduct, certainly it can use the WEF code of conduct as a basis as well. But it is important to understand that if it's if it's an MA only member, that it's got to be reviewed at the MA level and not at the WEF level. But again, those folks holding the dual membership to WEF and the MA are required to abide by the code. So just continuing on the next slide with the considerations, reiterating that point, while there may be multiple codes, there may be obviously the WEF code of conduct and an MA conduct, WEF has jurisdiction over the WEF membership. So going back to that concept, if there is to be disciplinary action, WEF can only act on that member's conduct at the WEF membership level. Because of course, it's tied, if that individual is tied to be an MA member as well, that can have an impact. If a WEF member is disciplined and they have to be part of that MA function and they lose their WEF membership, then they're really not entitled to participate in that MA process as well, unless that MA has a non-member. I know there's a lot of acronyms around, and so I definitely want your questions throughout it as we kind of peel the layers here as well. WEF will communicate with MAs as appropriate as it relates to the code of conduct. We have policies, again, what we'll be rolling out are the policies and the codes behind them. So for MA participants listening in, these matters may trickle to the MA, of course, to the extent someone is a WEF member. So that's something to be mindful of as well. And as I mentioned, if the WEF membership is in jeopardy, and ultimately if it's lost, then that can trigger the loss of the MA membership where you've got the dual membership categories. And as I mentioned earlier, we hope that the WEF code of conduct could be a good basis for the MA's code of conduct, should it choose to move in that direction. So with that said, I'm going to turn it back over to talk about the delivery mechanisms.
Thank you, Barbara. The code of conduct is currently posted on the WEF website, and it is now in effect, having been approved by the Board of Trustees at the July board meeting. We are going to be communicating about this as we move forward. We're going to have some text in the September newsletter. We're also going to have some text about this in the WEF Tech Now communications that go out in September and October. And we are adding the affirmative consent signature line or a text box to our membership applications and renewals. Online, they should be operational probably in December of this year. The print applications will have that probably in January of 2022. There is a lead time for making these changes. And we will be including communication about this when we onboard new members. So all of that is currently in the works as part of phase 1. In phase 2, we're going to be looking at expanding the communication about this to the volunteer handbook and also making sure that this information is available to the House of Delegates. And in terms of a toolkit, we are very happy to work with the MAs on developing a toolkit to do a code of conduct at the MA level if the MA is interested in doing this. And so if you are interested in doing this, please reach out to us And Lisa and Kelsey and the association engagement staff are happy to help with that effort. And so now I'd like to go on to the next slide and turn it back to John.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Barbara. I do see that we have a few questions and comments in the chat. So far, this process has not been particularly painful, and hopefully the questions won't be anything too challenging, but we have some expert staff here to be able to address any of the questions that you do have. Debbie has one. Is there a distinction between WEF MA functions and MA functions? Are they one and the same? I will answer, and then I will allow others who know better to correct me. But in essence, a WEF MA function and MA function are one and the same. The issue there is really not the function per se, but really the membership. If it's a MA only member, as Barbara was addressing before, versus a MA WEF member. So the functions are really one and the same. Kathleen, Barbara, anybody else that want to revise that?
Well said, John. Absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you. Jack has a couple of comments here. WEF has approximately 70 MAs that need the same dynamic for the code of conduct. So I will take that as a positive compliment to the code of conduct. So thank you, Jack. And lifetime members, of course, should be role models for the for the code of conduct. And that's probably true of all leaders and all of us. We should be role models as well. Another question here, will there be something available that can be distributed to the MAs for their newsletters? With that being said, Kelsey, Kathleen, anybody want to chime in, Lisa, about what we are going to be able to provide beyond what we have already provided?
Well, would we have the copy ready for the newsletters in September, and then for the WEF Tech Now communications, we're happy to make that available to our MAs. So yes, we can certainly do that.
And then on the behalf of the delegates, I'll make sure that we send that out to all the delegates to get to their MA newsletters. So we will do that as soon as we receive it.
Okay, thank you, Nikita. So it's about jurisdiction regarding membership, correct? Yes, relative to the question before about an MA event versus WEF MA event, the distinction here is jurisdiction comes down really more to the membership as whether or not an individual is a WEF member, which goes to the next question from Debbie, and that is the broad definition of WEF participants seems to include everyone in attendance, but we are excluding MA members only. Understandably, a little confusing there. This has more to do between who may be a complainant versus a respondent. So, and Barbara, again, I'm using legal terms here that I'm not qualified to use, so correct me as you need to. But anybody can lodge a complaint. We, from a WEF standpoint, only would have jurisdiction over, if that's the viable term, over a WEF member or a WEF MA member. We would not have any jurisdiction over a non-WEF member if the complaint is being lodged against a non-WEF member. That doesn't mean that WEF would not want to know about it and possibly take action. For example, if it was at WEF Tech and it was not a WEF member, but it was a staff at the convention center or something of that nature, that can be brought to us, but it would be handled by a different process.
Hey, John.
Barbara, please clean that response up, or anybody else.
Yeah, so I also wanted to point out, I raised my hand, but you know, for many years now, I don't think many of us has realized, but if you attend WEF Tech or any specialty conference or any other WEF event, there's a whole separate code of conduct that you have agreed to in registration for that event. So in those particular cases where you may be at a WEF event, and like John's saying here, it could be, you know, an exhibitor who's not necessarily a WEF member. There are other avenues and other kind of codes of conduct that they have agreed to in agreeing to participate in that event, where we have the ability to take action. But he's right. This comes back to, it is a membership jurisdiction, kind of like the chat was saying, but there are things for non-members, those participants who are at that event, who have agreed to a separate code of conduct relating to their attendance at that event. I hope that makes it clearer, not more confusing.
Thank you, Amy. And your son there blinded me, so I couldn't see your hand being raised in the background there. Thank you. Are MAs, this is from Doug Pike, are MAs required to report a local incident to WEF? Well, it depends as to what you define as incident. If it is a complaint, that complaint can go to the MA. And if it's a WEF member, the MA can then bring that complaint to WEF, or the person who filed the complainant can also then use our process. Once again, I'm going to ask Kathleen or Barbara or anybody else to step in and refine my response.
That's correct, John.
Thank you. Lucas asked, does the Code of Conduct cover egregious or other extreme conduct of a member outside of WEF functions that may impact their ability to represent the organization in a professional manner? Yes, if you read the member discipline policy, there are, it's professional, it's personal, and it's legal misconduct. So should WEF become aware of legal misconduct, for example, or professional misconduct that didn't necessarily come through the complaint process directly, that is still something that can be used for that purpose as well.
Yeah, and John, I'll just make the point, as you indicated, of those three areas, personal, professional, and legal misconduct, that the examples that are in the code that you'll see are just that. They're examples. The committee and the stakeholders worked really hard to try to refine those. But here again, this is an example of where if you don't see something on that list, it doesn't mean that it might not necessarily be included. It's just that by way of examples, those are the ones that are given.
Thank you, Barbara. Jack states that the Florida Water Quality Association has Category J members who are not WEF members. Of course, other MAs have such membership categories, and perhaps we could have aspirational COC statements for all participants. Here you get into an issue of jurisdiction and how encompassing and possibly over-encompassing beyond what we have direct responsibilities for. And we did want to not overstep any bounds in a world today where there's some sensitivity to that. So we prefer to limit it to just our membership in that respect, but we do hope and expect that any engagement with any people whatsoever relative to WEF functions will always abide by the proper etiquette, protocol, and so on as defined in the Code of Conduct. And once again, I ask others to voice anything else that they would like to add to that one.
Well, I think that's right.
What remedy for non-members if they violate a COC? Either at WEF or MAs, it really depends on a couple of different issues. One is Amy cited before, let's say an exhibitor did something at WEF Tech and that individual is not a WEF member, but their organization is a corporate partner because they are exhibited. Clearly, that's a different situation than would be if it was a Freeman person. But even in that situation, whether it was a Freeman employee who may have violated what we would consider to be the Code of Conduct, they are still an engaged contractor to WEF. So there's still a process that could be followed there, but that really does not pertain to the COC that we have introduced here today. Jim has put, is there a liability for WEF and or the MA if a member is somehow sanctioned, suspended, or expelled due to an arraignment or indictment for a serious crime, and that the member is later found innocent or of the charges or dropped? It seems that a conviction should be required. You can't, in this situation, pass judgment on all situations. Each and every situation has to be basically reviewed on its own and stand on its own merits. Should we feel from an ethics subcommittee and the board, and then an appeal committee, if that came into play as well, that there is sufficient ground, then we would still take action. Is there potential liability? Of course, anything that we do, there's potential liability. But as long as we're following a defined process that we have here, that we believe has been properly vetted, all we can do is to do our best and hopefully avoid mistakes, but there's never a guarantee. Barbara, that's probably one I should have just said, Barbara, why don't you answer this?
Yeah, no, well said, John. No, absolutely, that's correct. Every situation is different. I can tell you from my experience and best practices that sometimes when we find out about an arrest or an indictment, the committee may determine to just wait and see what happens. And that happens a lot. In other circumstances, they may not wait. And so here again, it's just a matter of the nature of the issue involved. And again, we want to leave some discretion there. In terms of liability, as John mentioned, there's always the potential of liability. The work of the committee, ethics subcommittee, just as the work of the board, those are protected under our director and officer liability policy for the insurance. So again, there's always, the insurance coverage issue is all a whole other discussion item, but the activities of committee members do fall within that scope. So it is something to think about as from the individual serving in that role, and as well as from the organization serving in that role. Again, I think what each step embodies, you'll see in that process, legal counsel will be involved in every step. So knocking on wood as I speak here, I would say that, when I've been involved in those processes, we get to a point and we're able to avoid any potential exposure if we handle the process correctly.
Thank you, Barbara. And by the way, my legal degree is from Perry Mason University, if you can find that one. Jack corrects me that it's the Federal Water Quality Association. Sorry, Jack, being from Florida, everything's about Florida. So, well, being from Florida now. So, are there any other questions? Any other comments? Another one here, subjective question. Would it be better if the MA adopted or used part of the WEF COC or have their own? That it can only, and MA is the only one who can answer that. I think we would not want to speak on behalf of the MAs. I'm happy to let Mary address that if she chose to, but they're free to do as they wish, including adopt us as a whole or to develop their own or any part thereof. Mary, you want to chime in?
Sure. Because I was on this earlier committee, we looked at the same thing and we had the same question. I think there's a benefit of having WEF as your national organization that spent the time to create these code of conduct. It's a lot of effort, and from our perspective, we're going to raise it at our executive committee meeting in September, but we plan to, or at least I'm hoping, is to adopt what WEF has put in place. So it provides for continuity, and then there's less of a potential issue that could rise between that membership. Now, we don't have very many members that aren't WEF members. We have a couple of categories that are non-WEF members, but the goal would be is to use the same process ideally. So then it kind of flows up and down between WEF and the MA. So from my perspective, I think it would be advantageous.
Thank you, Mary.
Sure.
Any other questions? We gave this an hour and a half or 90 minutes, just in case there were a lot of questions. And Jack has the US EPA Science Advisory Board has a code of ethics and ethical conduct, which has been cited as a very good template for ethical behavior. It wouldn't hurt to look this over as well. That's another possibility. Again, we wanted to make a distinction between a code of ethics and a code of conduct, primarily from an ethics standpoint, being aspirational, what we choose to aspire to versus what we expect everybody to do relative to code of conduct. So. Any other questions, comments, concerns before we end a meeting 45 minutes early? Actually 48 right now, that might be
amazing.
All right, so with that, I'm going to thank everybody who helped the stakeholder group, staff, Barbara Dunn as well. This never would have been done as effectively and as quickly as it was. So I thank everybody there. And with that said, I'm going to kick it back over to Nikita.
Can you hear me? This is Lynn. Let's make sure to answer this question in the chat about if an MA needs advice, who should they contact?
Oh, thank you, Lynn. Kathleen, do you want to tackle that one?
You can go ahead and contact us, and we depending on what the issue is, may refer to Barbara or ask you to contact someone else. So it would depend on the issue, but we're happy to be a first place to begin the process.
Kathleen, though, let's be really clear to people, should they go to Lisa, to their normal MA contact, to you?
Yes, the normal MA contact.
Okay.
We have more questions filtering in, John, if you want to.
Yeah, I see them. All right, so Peter, yes, MA leadership, if I remember correctly, MA staff and House of Delegates were all invited to this webinar. It is being recorded. I failed to mention that. It is being recorded. So it is available or will be available shortly. So that can be shared with MA leadership as well. Julie, great work to all the stakeholder group. The COC is needed and appreciated. Thank you, Julie. Hope to see you at WEF, Julie. And thank you for excellent brief and an excellent program. And that's because everybody involved participated and really did help. So thank you again. And I'll try to throw it back over to Nikita.
Perfect. Thank you so much, John. I just want to thank everyone that was on this committee. It was a lot of work, a lot of edits, a lot of questions, a lot of hard decisions that went through this. So just thank you so much for putting this in place. With that said, a last call for questions. If you don't want to type, just raise your hand really quickly. Just get a quick hand raise in and we can call on you. I'm going to do a countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, that's it. We're going to close early. So thank you. Oh, Doug, was that a question? Oh, a hand, a wave. Okay. All right. We're going to close this early. Once again, if you have any questions, go to Kathleen. Who do they go to for questions again? I missed that. I'm so sorry.
If there's an issue that you want raised forward, start with your MA, your regular contact, Lisa Ruane or her staff, and she'll be in touch with me and we'll figure out where to go from there.
Perfect. So for those MA leaders, delegates should know who their contact is. And if not, we can contact Kelsey or Lisa to get that contact information. We'll go from there. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Have a fabulous afternoon and we will see you again soon. And we'll see you at WEF Tech. Take care, everybody.
Everyone.
Thanks. Be safe.